September 14th, 1998, 11:45 p.m. University District, Bellingham, Washington. The autumn rain drummed against the windows of the Red Square Diner as Nicole Anderson finished her late shift, counting tips and cleaning tables in the nearly empty 21-year-old Western Washington University junior had been working at the all-night diner for 2 years, saving money for graduates pursuing her degree in environment. The diner sat at the edge of campus, a 24-hour refuge, students cramming for exams and night grabbing coffee before heading home. Located on Cornwall Avenue, it occupied the ground floor of a converted warehouse, with residential apartments above and the Nooksack River flowing darkly the building. "You sure you don't want me to wait until your ride gets here?" asked Jake Morrison, the night cook. Nicole's roommate Sarah was supposed to pick her up at midnight. Heavy rain and homecoming weekend traffic had delayed her. "I'll be fine," tucking her tips into her purse, along with her biology text and lab. Sarah texted that she's 5 minutes away. "I'll wait inside until I..." The diner's location made it a popular late-night spot, but it also put it at the intersection of two worlds, the relatively safe university campus and the rougher warehouse district that housed several bars, pool halls, and businesses that operated in the margins of. Nicole had always been carrying pepper spray and avoiding the darker section of the warehouse district alone, but tonight felt different. There had been more unusual activity around the diner over the past week, with expensive cars arriving at odd hours and meetings conducted in whispered conversations at corner booths. At 11:52 p.m., Nicole's phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. "Stuck in traffic by the stadium? Maybe 10 more minutes? Stay inside." Through the rain-streaked windows, Nicole watched the street for Sarah's blue Honda Civic while finishing her closing duty. The warehouse district was mostly dark except for the neon glow of Mickey's Tavern across the street and the occasional headlights of cars navigating the narrow roads between buildings. At exactly midnight, a black Mercedes pulled into the diner's parking lot, its windows tinted dark enough to obscure the occupant. Nicole had seen the car before during her recent, always arriving late at night and parking in the shadows near the building's loading dock. The driver's side door opened, and a well-dressed man in his 50s emerged, scanning the area carefully before walking toward the diner's entrance. Nicole recognized him as someone who had been meeting regularly with Tony Castellano, a local businessman who owned several properties in the warehouse. "We're closed," Nicole called through the locked glass door as the man approached. "I'm looking for Tony. He said he'd be here for a late meeting." Nicole glanced toward the corner booth where Castellano usually conducted his late-night business, but tonight it was empty. "Mr. Castellano left about an hour ago. You might try Mickey's Tavern. He sometimes goes there after his meetings." The man studied Nicole's face carefully, as if memorizing her features. "What's your name, honey?" Something in his tone made Nicole step back from the door. "I'm sorry, but you'll have to come back to..." "Nicole Anderson," the man said, reading her name tag through the glass. "Pretty name? You work here often?" Nicole felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn rain. "Look, I need to ask you to leave. My manager doesn't allow non-customers to hang around after closing." Smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Sure thing, Nicole. Have a good night." As the Mercedes pulled away, Nicole noticed it didn't head toward Mickey's Tavern or any of the other late-night establishments. Instead, it circled the block and parked in an alley where it would have a clear view of the diner's parking lot. At 12:15 a.m., Sarah's Honda finally appeared through the rain. Nicole grabbed her purse and biology, turned off the diner's interior light, and locked the front door. The short walk to Sarah's car would take less than 30 seconds, but as she stepped into the parking lot, Nicole realized the Mercedes had moved closer. "Nicole, over here," Sarah called from her car, parked near the street entrance. Nicole walked quickly toward the Honda, her keys ready and pepper spray within reach. But as she passed between two parked cars, figures emerged from the shadows. The well-dressed man from earlier and two others who moved with coordinated precision of people experienced in violence. "Nicole Anderson," the man said. "We need to talk." "Girl, Sarah, go!" screamed, but her roommate's music was loud enough to muffle the sound through closed windows and heavy rain. Nicole tried to run toward Sarah's car, but one of the men blocked her path while another grabbed her arm. The well-dressed man approached, something in his hand, a syringe that glinted in the mercury vapor lighting. "This will go easier if you don't fight," he said in the same calm tone he'd used at the diner's door. Nicole's last clear memory was the sharp pain in her neck and the sight of Sarah's taillights disappearing into the rainy night as her roommate drove away, unaware that her best friend was being dragged into the back of a Mercedes by people who'd been watching her for days. The parking lot fell silent except for the sound of rain on asphalt and the distant hum of traffic on the university campus. By the time campus security made their routine patrol past the diner at 12:45 a.m., Nicole Anderson had vanished without a trace, leaving behind only her biology textbook lying open in a puddle and her car keys scattered across the wet pavement. The Red Square Diner would close permanently 3 months later, its owner citing concerns about safety in the warehouse. But Nicole's disappearance had nothing to do with random crime or campus security issues. She'd witnessed something during night shifts that made her a liability to people who eliminated problems efficiently and permanently. In the morning, her absence would be discovered, launching an investigation that would consume the next 7 years and ultimately expose a criminal organization that had been operating under the cover of legitimate business for over a decade. September 15, 1998, 8:30 a.m. Bellingham Police Department, Washington. Detective Lisa Parks stared at the missing person report on her desk, noting the unusual circumstances that had brought Nicole Anderson's disappearance to police attention so quickly. Most college students weren't reported missing until they'd been gone for at least 24 hours, but Nicole's roommate had contacted campus security within hours of losing contact. She was supposed to pick Nicole up at midnight. Sarah Chen, Nicole's roommate and best friend since freshman year. When I got to the diner, I couldn't find her anywhere. Her biology book was lying in a puddle in the parking lot, and her keys were scattered. She'd dropped them while running. Detective James Wilson, Parks' partner 3 years, reviewed the initial incident report filed by campus security. The night manager at the diner confirmed that Nicole was there when he left at 11:45 p.m. She was supposed to wait inside until her ride arrived. Park had worked missing persons cases for 5 years and recognized the signs of something more serious than a college student making poor. Nicole Anderson was a responsible young woman with no history of risky behavior, strong family relationships, clear academic and career goals. Tell me about Nicole's routine. Did she have any problems with anyone? Boyfriends, co-workers, professors? Nicole kept to herself mostly. She worked at the diner 3 nights a week, studied constantly, and spent weekends volunteering at the environmental center. She wasn't dating anyone serious, and she got along well with everyone at work. Wilson consulted his notes from the initial scene examination. We found her textbook keys, but no signs of a struggle. No blood, no torn clothing, nothing to suggest violence. But Park noticed details that suggested a different story. Nicole's keys had been found scattered in a pattern consistent with dropping them while being dragged or carried. Her textbook showed water damage from lying in the rain for at least an hour, indicating she'd been taken shortly after midnight, rather than leaving voluntarily later. The Red Square Diner was a modest establishment with a reputation for serving decent food to students and night shift. Park interviewed the staff, learning that Nicole was well-liked and reliable, but several employees mentioned unusual activity around the restaurant in recent weeks. There's been more late-night meetings than usual, explained Jake Morris, the night cook who'd worked with Cole on her last shift. Expensive cars, people in suits having conversations at the corner booth. Different crowd than our usual customer. Did Nicole ever mention feeling uncomfortable or not specific? She'd been more careful, always making sure someone walked her car, asking me to keep an eye on who's coming and going, like she sensed was off. Park examined the diner's in the warehouse, noting its proximity to several businesses that operated on the margin of legality. The area was known for hosting enterprises that attracted people seeking privacy for activities they preferred to keep away from campus and downtown Bellingham. The investigation's first major lead came from the diner's primitive security. A single camera covered the front entrance, providing grainy black and white footage of the parking lot and street. The tape from Nicole's last shift showed her usual routine until approximately midnight. A dark sedan appeared in the parking. Can we enhance this image? Wilson asked the department's technical specialist. Not much. The system's old and the lighting's poor, but I can tell you it's a luxury sedan, probably German, and there are at least 2 people inside. The enhanced footage showed a figure approaching the diner's entrance around midnight, but the person's features were obscured by shadows and the camera's limited resolution. More concerning, what happened? The figure returned to the sedan, which moved to a position providing surveillance of the parking. Someone was watching. Parks wasn't random. The canvas of the warehouse district yielded frustration. Several businesses had closed early due to the rain, and those that remained open reported seeing nothing unusual. Mickey's Tavern, directly across from the diner, had been busy with homecoming weekend crowds, and staff members were too distracted to notice activity in the parking lot. Park's investigation uncovered information about the late-night meetings Jake Morris had mentioned. The corner booth at Red Square Diner had been regularly used by Tony Castellano, a local businessman who owned several properties in the warehouse district and had connections throughout Bellingham's business community. Castellanos, legitimate as far as we know, Wilson reported, after running background checks, owns a construction company, some rental properties, and a couple of restaurants. No criminal record, pays his taxes, active in local business organizations. Park wasn't convinced that legitimacy on paper meant legitimacy in practice. The expensive cars and secretive meetings suggested activities that wouldn't be conducted in public if they were entirely legal. The search for Nicole expanded to include campus security footage, traffic cameras, and surveillance systems at businesses throughout the university district. The timeline showed her normal routine until midnight, then nothing, as if she'd simply vanished from existence. "We need to treat this as a kidnapping," Park told Lieutenant Patricia Walsh during their morning briefing 3 days after the disappearance. Nicole Anderson didn't leave voluntarily, and someone went to considerable effort to take her without leaving evidence. Walsh authorized additional resources for the investigation, including detective overtime and consultation with federal agencies that specialized in kidnapping. But as the first week passed without significant leads, Park realized they were dealing with sophisticated to plan and execute Nicole's disappearance without leaving obvious. The emotional impact on Nicole's family and friends was devastating. Her parents, David and Martha Anderson, drove up from Seattle and established a command post at a local hotel, coordinating with volunteers who were searching areas around Bellingham and posting flyers throughout the region. Nicole would never just disappear, Martha Anderson insisted during a tearful press conference. She was planning to apply to graduate school, talking about her thesis project, excited about her future. "Someone took our daughter, and we need help finding her." As September turned into October, Park expanded the investigation to include Nicole's academic work and environmental activism. The young woman had been researching water quality issues in Puget Sound for her senior thesis, work that occasionally brought her into contact with industrial operation and development projects. Could she have discovered something that made her a target? Park wondered aloud during a case review meeting. Environmental research doesn't usually get college students kidnapped, but he made notes to investigate Nicole's academic activity more thoroughly. The investigation had revealed Nicole Anderson as a responsible, well-liked young woman with no apparent enemies or dangerous associates. Her disappearance from a familiar location under routine circumstances suggested careful planning by people with resources and experience in making problems disappear. As the first month of investigation concluded without major breakthrough, Park realized that finding Nicole would require understanding the criminal activities that had brought dangerous people into her orbit through the late-night meetings at Red Square Diner. October 30th, 1998, 6 weeks missing. Bellingham Police Department. The evidence board in Conference Room A had grown into a complex timeline of Nicole's disappearance, but Detective Park stared at the gaps and inconsistencies that seemed to multiply rather than resolve with each new piece of information. 6 weeks of investigation had produced frustratingly little progress, despite extensive searches and hundreds of interviews. Tony Castellano's financial records are interesting, reported, spreading bank statements across the conference table. Large cash deposits that don't match his construction company's revenue, payments to shell companies, and regular transfers to accounts in the Cayman Islands. Park studied the financial patterns, recognizing the hallmarks of money laundering seen in federal training courses. What kind of construction projects generate this? The problem is company's legitimate projects don't account for the money's account. Either he's got unreported income streams or he's washing money. The investigation revealed that late-night meetings at a Red Square Diner involved more than simple business discussion. Phone records showed communication with individuals who had criminal background, including drug trafficking, and organized crime in Seattle and Vancouver. Look at this pattern, continued, pointing to a series of transactions. Every 2 weeks, large cash followed by immediate transfers to offshore accounts. And these payments always happen within 48 hours of the late-night meetings Nicole witnessed. Park felt the pieces beginning to connect. Nicole's disappearance coincided with her increasingly regular exposure to criminal activities conducted under the cover of legitimate business. Her work schedule had put her in position to observe activities that someone had deemed too dangerous to ignore. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Maria Santos, a housekeeper who cleaned several office buildings in the warehouse district, contacted police after seeing Nicole's photograph in the newspaper. "I saw that girl talking to some men outside the old fish processing about 2 weeks before she disappeared," Santos Park carefully interview. "She looked upset, like she was arguing with them about." "Can you describe the men?" "One was older, well-dressed, drove a black Mercedes. The other was younger, muscle. They seemed angry that she was asking questions about trucks that came and went at night." Santos led Park to the abandoned fish processing plant 6 blocks from the Red Square Diner. The building appeared vacant, but recent tire tracks and security modifications suggested it was being used for activities that required privacy and controlled access. Nicole came by here during her lunch breaks sometime. She was taking water sample in the river for some college project. That's when she started noticing the night sea. Park realized that Nicole's environmental research had put her in proximity to criminal activities she wasn't supposed to witness. Her academic work on water quality had made her a regular presence in areas where Castellanos' organization conducted business. The surveillance of the fish processing plant revealed patterns of activity that confirmed Park's suspicions. Trucks arrived late at night, stayed for several hours, and left carrying different cargo than what they'd brought. The operation was sophisticated and carefully timed to avoid attention from law enforcement or casual observers. "We're looking at a drug distribution hub," Park concluded. After reviewing surveillance, Nicole wasn't targeted because of her job at the diner. She was eliminated because her research made her a regular witness to trafficking. Wilson coordinated with federal agencies to investigate the interstate implication of the drug trafficking network. The scope of the operation suggested connections beyond Bellingham, involving distribution routes throughout the Pacific Northwest. DEA has been tracking increased heroin and cocaine flow through Washington ports, reported Agent Patricia Martinez in a federal briefing. The quantities suggest major distribution operation, but they haven't been able to identify the inland transportation network. Park shared intelligence about Castellanos' meetings and the suspicious activities at the fish processing plant. The federal agents were particularly interested in the financial networks that suggested money laundering operations worth millions of dollars. Nicole Anderson may have stumbled onto one of the largest drug trafficking operations in the region, Martinez. If that's true, her kidnappers have resources and experience that go far beyond local criminal activity. The investigation expanded to include electronic surveillance of Castellanos' communication and financial activities. Federal wiretaps revealed discussions about the college girl problem and references to permanent solutions that suggested Nicole's fate had been decided weeks earlier. "They're talking about eliminating evidence and witness," Park read during it. "If Nicole's still alive, probably being held while they handle exposure." The emotional toll on Nicole's intensive without significant. Her parents had established a permanent presence in Bellingham, working with volunteer organizations to supplement of "we can't accept" is gone. Nicole was careful and intelligent. If she's being held somewhere, she's looking for opportunity to escape or send signal to keep searching. Park admired the family's determination while recognizing the reality that kidnapping victims rarely survived longer than a few weeks when organized crime was involved. The sophisticated planning evident in Nicole's disappearance suggested people who understood the importance of eliminating witnesses permanently. The case took a darker turn when Maria Santos was attacked outside her apartment building in early November. She survived, but the message was clear. People who cooperated with the police investigation would face consequences. "This is organized crime territory now," Lieutenant Walsh concluded during a security. "We're not just investigating a missing college. We're dealing with people who routinely use violence to protect their why." Park arranged for Santos to receive protective custody while the investigation continued. The attack demonstrated that the criminal organization was aware of police activities and willing to intimidate witnesses to prevent further cooperation. As November progressed, Park realized that finding Nicole would require understanding the full scope of the drug trafficking network and the people who controlled it. The college student's disappearance was just one element of a criminal enterprise that generated millions of dollars and eliminated threats without hesitation. The investigation had evolved from a missing person case into a battle against organized crime, with Nicole's life hanging in the balance somewhere in a network of safe house and distribution facilities that stretched throughout the Pacific Northwest. January 12, 1999. 4 months missing. DEA Field Office, Seattle. Special Agent Patricia Martinez reviewed the Nicole Anderson case file with growing concern, noting the pattern of sophisticated criminal activity that had emerged during the Bellingham Police Department's investigation. The file had been escalated to federal attention after wiretaps revealed discussions about interstate drug traffic and money laundering operations worth millions of dollars. The trafficking network is using Bellingham as a major distribution hub for heroin, cocaine flowing from Vancouver to cities throughout the assembled town. Anderson's disappearance appears to be connected to her accidental exposure to transport and money laundering activity. Detective Park had been invited to participate in the federal investigation, bringing 4 months of local intelligence about Tony Castellanos' organization and the suspicious activities Nicole had witnessed during her environment. Nicole was taking water samples near the old fish process plant for her college thesis, Park reported. Her research put her in regular contact with areas where the trafficking network conducted nighttime operations. She wasn't investigating crime, she just happened to be in the wrong place consistently enough to become a threat. Agent Rodriguez, who specialized in organized crime investigations, consulted intelligence files about drug trafficking networks operating between Canada and the United States. The volume of drugs moving through this corridor suggests coordination with major suppliers in Vancouver and distribution networks in California and Arizona. The federal investigation revealed the scope of corruption that had enabled the trafficking network to operate with minimal law enforcement interference. Castellanos' organization had cultivated relationships with port officials, customs agents, and local law enforcement officers who provided advance warning about enforcement activity. We've identified at least 3 police officers who've received payments from the organization, Martinez announced during a secure briefing. Information about investigation and raid planning has been routinely leaked to criminal leadership. Park felt sick, realizing that her investigation had been compromised from the beginning. Details about search activity, witness interviews, and surveillance operations had been shared with the very people she was trying to investigate. How do we proceed if we can't trust local law enforcement channels? Park asked. Carefully, Martinez replied. We'll maintain operational security by limiting information sharing and using federal resources for sensitive activity. Your local knowledge is crucial, but we need to assume that everything we do will be reported to the criminal organization. The task force established a secure facility away from local police stations and federal buildings using encrypted communications and carefully vetted personnel. Their investigation would run parallel to Park's local efforts with minimal information sharing until they could identify and eliminate security leaks. Agent Chen coordinated technical surveillance of the trafficking network using federal resources that were unavailable to local police departments. Sophisticated monitoring equipment revealed the extent of the organization's communications and the geographic scope of their operation. They're using legitimate businesses cover for drug transportation and money laundering, Chen reported. Construction companies, shipping firms, and restaurant operations provide infrastructure for moving drugs and cleaning. The surveillance revealed that Nicole's kidnapping had been ordered by Viktor Kozlov, a Russian organized crime figure who controlled drug trafficking ops throughout the Pacific. Kozlov operated from Vancouver, but maintained facilities and personnel in Washington, Oregon. Kozlov specializes in eliminating threats to trafficking operations, Martinez explained to Park during a briefing about the organization's leadership. He's suspected in at least 12 disappearances over the 5 years, including law enforcement officers, journalists, and potential witnesses. The federal investigation identified 3 facilities where Nicole might be held: a warehouse complex near Everett, a rural compound in the Cascade Mountains, and a fish processing facility on the Olympic Peninsula. All were heavily guarded and inaccessible to conventional surveillance. We need someone inside the organization. The only way to locate and gather evidence against the traffic through an undercover operation. Agent Thompson volunteered for the assignment. With a background in narcotics investigations and fluent Russian, he could pose as a corrupt customs official willing to facilitate drug shipments for appropriate compensation. The undercover operation began in February 1999, with Thompson establishing contact with mid-level figures in Kozlov's organization. His progress was slow and dangerous. Gaining trust required participating in illegal activity, and any mistake could result in his death and the elimination of Nicole as a witness. "They're testing me constant," Thompson reported during secure communication. "Small jobs at first, helping to coordinate shipping schedules and avoid enforcement activity, but they're watching everything I do, and one wrong move will compromise the entire operation." Meanwhile, Park continued her local investigation through conventional method, following financial risks and interviewing witnesses, while the federal task force pursued their covert approach. The parallel investigations occasionally conflicted, but both teams recognized that finding Nicole required multiple strategies. The breakthrough came when Thompson was invited to participate in a special security project involving the management of someone who had caused problems for business. The assignment was a test of his loyalty, but it also represented an opportunity to gather intelligence about how the organization handled threats. "They want me to help with a relocation operation, something about moving a problem from temporary storage to a more permanent solution." Martinez realized they might be about to discover Nicole's location. If she was dead, her body might be at the facility Thompson was being sent to relocate. If she was alive, the operation might represent her execution. "We need to be ready to move on multiple locations simultaneously," Martinez announced to the task force. "If Thompson's cover gets blown, we'll have one chance to recover him and Nicole before the organization destroys all evidence." As winter turned to spring, the investigation had evolved into a complex operation involving multiple agencies, undercover assets, and the constant threat that Nicole Anderson was running out of time. Somewhere in the network of criminal facilities and safe houses, a college student was either suffering in captivity or already dead because she'd accidentally witnessed drug trafficking operation. The task force was preparing for a coordinated that would either rescue Nicole or recover her body, simultaneously taking down one of the largest drug traffic Pacific. April 8, 1999, 7 months missing. Cascade Mountain, Washington. Agent Thompson adjusted the hidden recording device sewn into his jacket as he followed Viktor Kozlov's lieutenant, Dmitry Volkov, up a winding mountain road toward a compound that had been invisible to satellite surveillance. 2 months of undercover work had finally earned him access to the trafficking network's secure facilities, but he was about to learn the true cost of that access. "This is where we handle special problems," explained in accented, gesturing toward a cluster of buildings hidden among tall palms surrounded by security. "People who see too much ask wrong questions, make life difficult for business." The compound appeared to be a legitimate logging operation with equipment yards and processing facilities that provided cover for more sinister activity. But Thompson noticed details that suggested a different purpose. Reinforced buildings with no visible windows, multiple layers of security fencing, and armed guards positioned throughout the complex. "How many problems have you handled here?" Thompson, trying to sound casual while gathering intelligence for the federal task force. "Past 2 years, maybe 15, 20. Some problems solve themselves when people understand consequences. Others require more direct management." Volkov led him to a concrete building set apart from the main logging operations, using a key card to access a door marked with warnings in Russian and English. The interior was divided into holding areas, interrogation rooms, and what appeared to be disposal facilities designed for eliminating evidence. "This is where we evaluate threats to determine appropriate responses," Volkov continued. "Sometimes education and financial incentives are sufficient. Other times, permanent solutions become necessary." Thompson felt his heart rate increase as he realized he was touring a facility designed for kidnapping, torture, and murder. The federal task force had theorized about such location, but seeing the infrastructure of systematic violence was deeply disturbing. "What about the college girl who was asking questions about our transportation schedule?" Volkov's expression darkened. "Nicole Anderson. She was stubborn one, refused to understand that some research projects are too dangerous to continue. We tried warnings, intimidation, various forms of pressure, but she remained uncooperative. Is she still here? In special holding area. Her case has become teaching example for other potential problems. When people ask questions about our operation, we explain what happened to curious students who don't mind their own business. Thompson struggled to maintain his cover while processing the revelation that Nicole had been held at the compound for 7 months. But Volkov wasn't finished with his tour. Would you like to see current inventory while we discuss your assignment? They walked to another section of the building, where Volkov used a second keycard to access a corridor lined with reinforced doors. Through small observation windows, Thompson could see that several cells were occupied by people who appeared to be in various stages of captivity and abuse. These are individuals who have become problematic for business operation. Volkov. Some will be relocated to different assignments. Others will be processed for permanent disposal based on threat assessment. In the last cell, Thompson saw a young woman who matched Nicole Anderson's description from the missing person reports. She was alive but appeared severely weakened by months of captivity, showing signs of systematic abuse and psychological torture. When she looked up at the observation, her eyes held a mixture of defiance and desperation. That's the Anderson girl, noticing Thompson's interest. 7 months of various persuasion techniques, and she still insists she can expose our operation. Remarkable resilience for college student. Thompson realized that Nicole had endured nearly 7 months while maintaining enough psychological strength to be considered a continuing threat. Her survival was extraordinary, but it also meant she possessed detailed knowledge about the trafficking network. What's the timeline for her disposal? That depends on operation security requirement. If we're moving facilities within next month, she comes with us for continued research. If timeline extends longer, permanent resolution becomes more practical. As they concluded the facility tour, Volkov outlined Thompson's assignment: help coordinate the transfer of problematic assets to disposal sites while ensuring that no evidence remained to connect the network to their previous activity. Tomorrow we begin moving several assets to final resolution, Volkov announced. Your job is transportation logistics and site preparation. Consider it final test before full membership in organization. Thompson maintained his cover long enough to complete the facility inspection and agree to participate in the disposal operation. But as soon as he was alone, he activated his emergency communication device to alert the federal task force. Nicole Anderson is alive, but in immediate danger. He reported during a secure transmission that the organization is planning to eliminate multiple prisoners within 48 hours, including her. We need to move immediately. Agent Martinez coordinated the emergency response from the Task Force Command Center in Seattle. We're moving all assets into position for simultaneous strikes on 4 facilities. Local SWAT teams are standing by, and we've got federal agents ready to move on the mountain compound. Detective Park joined the federal operation after months of frustration with the compromised local investigation. Her knowledge of the case and determination to find Nicole made her a valuable addition to the rescue team. After 7 months, we finally know where she is, Park said as she checked her equipment. But we've got maybe 18 hours before they kill her and eliminate all the evidence. The stakes couldn't have been higher. The trafficking net was preparing to relocate their operations to new territories, which meant eliminating witnesses and destroying evidence that could connect them to years of criminal activity. Nicole's survival provided the trafficking network with a test case for their security protocols, but it had also given federal agents the break they needed to locate and infiltrate the organization. As darkness fell over the Cascade Mountains, federal agents and local police prepared for an operation that would either rescue a college student or recover her body from the people who'd held her captive for 7 months. The investigation that had begun with Nicole's disappearance was about to reach its climax, with her life hanging in the balance and the future of a major trafficking network at stake. April 9, 1999, 3:15 Cascade Mountains compound, Washington. The assault teams moved through the pre-dawn forest like shadows, their night vision equipment turning the mountain compound into a green-tinged maze of buildings and security obstacles. Agent Martinez coordinated the operation from a command vehicle positioned 2 miles down the mountain road, while Detective Park prepared to breach the building where Nicole Anderson was being held. All teams in position, heard Agent Chen through a tactical radio network. Thermal imaging shows approximately 22 people inside the compound, with at least 8 in the detention facility. The plan called for simultaneous entry through 6 access points, overwhelming the facility defensive guards, eliminate prisoners, or destroy evidence. Agent Thompson remained undercover inside the compound, ready to guide rescue teams to Nicole's location while maintaining his cover as long as possible. Team Alpha, execute in 60 seconds, Martinez commanded. Remember, we have confirmed hostages in the detention area. This is a rescue operation with extreme prejudice for anyone who threatens prisoner safety. Park checked her equipment one final time, focusing on the bolt cutters and medical supplies that would be needed to extract prisoners who had been held for months. After 7 months of investigation, Nicole Anderson was finally within reach. The next few minutes would determine whether she survived captivity. At precisely 3:20 a.m., the assault began with coordinated explosions disabled the compound's communications equipment and backup. Emergency lighting activated throughout the complex, casting stark shadows as federal agents poured through breached fences and building entrance. Federal agents, everyone on the ground, echoed through the buildings as tactical teams secured each area methodically. The compound's security force had been caught completely off guard, with most surrendering immediately when faced with overwhelming federal firepower. Park followed Team Bravo to detention, where Thompson was waiting with access and detailed of the building's layout. Nicole's in cell 12, but there are 6 other prisoners. Volkov was planning to execute all of them today. The detention facility was secured within minutes, but accessing individual cells required careful coordination. Each door was electronically locked and equipped with surveillance system that could only be disabled from a central control station. "I've got the control panel," Agent Rodriguez reported from the facility's security office. "All cell doors are unlocked, but several prisoners appear to be unconscious or severely weakened." Park reached cell 12 first, pulling open the heavy door to find Nicole huddled against the wall, conscious but clearly traumatized by months of captivity. She was awake but seemed unable to process that her ordeal was ending, staring at Park, a hollow expression of someone who'd given up hope of rescue. "Nicole, I'm Detective Park with Bellingham Police. You're safe now. We're here to get you." Nicole stared at her without speaking, as if unable to believe that help. Park knelt beside her, checking obvious injuries, speaking in calm, reassuring tone. "Can you stand? We need to get you to medical attention right away." Nicole nodded weakly, allowing Park to help her to her feet. She appeared to have lost significant weight and showed signs of prolonged physical and psychological abuse, but she was alive and responsive. "My research," Nicole whispered, her voice barely audible. "I hid my environmental data before they took me. Evidence about the contamination. We'll get your research later," Park assured her. "Right now, we need to focus on getting you medical treatment and safety." As rescue teams evacuated the prisoners, other agents secured the facility's records and computer system. The intelligence gathered during the raid would provide evidence for prosecuting the entire traffic, but the immediate priority was ensuring the survival of people who'd been held captive for months. The raid's most dramatic moment came when Viktor Kozlov attempted to escape through a concealed tunnel that connected the detention facility to a helicopter landing pad hidden in the forest. Agent Chen intercepted him as he emerged near a waiting aircraft, leading to a brief firefight that ended with Kozlov's capture. Viktor Kozlov, you're under arrest for kidnapping, drug trafficking, and conspiracy to commit murder, Chen announced as federal agents handcuffed the Russian crime boss who'd overseen Nicole's torture. Kozlov remained silent during his arrest, but his capture represented a major breakthrough in the investigation. As the network's enforcement specialist, he possessed detailed knowledge about the organization's structure, methods, and locations of other facilities. By 5:30 a.m., the raid was complete. 7 prisoners had been rescued, including Nicole and 6 other individuals who'd been scheduled for execution. 21 members of the trafficking network were in custody, along with computers, financial records, and communications equipment that would provide evidence for prosecuting the broader conspiracy. Nicole was transported to Harborview Medical Center in Seattle, where doctors began treating her for severe malnutrition, dehydration, and psychological trauma. Her physical condition was serious but stable, and her mental state appeared remarkably resilient, given the duration and severity of captivity. "She's been through an incredible ordeal, but she's a survivor," Dr. James Wong told Park during the initial medical evaluation. With proper treatment and time, she should full recovery. The other rescued prisoners were in various stages of physical and psychological deterioration, having been held for different periods and subjected to different abuse. All required immediate medical attention and would need months recovery and rehabilitation. As dawn broke over the Cascade Mountain, the compound that had served as a center for drug trafficking and systematic violence was transformed into a federal crime scene. Evidence teams would spend weeks documenting the facilities and gathering intelligence about the network. Detective Park sat in the hospital waiting room, reflecting on the investigation that had consumed 7 months of her career. Nicole Anderson was alive and safe, but the experience had changed both of them in ways that would take time to understand. The rescue was successful, but it was also the beginning of a new phase in the investigation. With Kozlov and other key figures in custody, federal agents would have opportunities to gather intelligence about the trafficking network's broader operation and identify additional victims who needed rescue. Most importantly, Nicole's survival meant that someone who'd witnessed the organization's crimes firsthand would be available to testify about the systematic abuse and criminal activities that had been conducted under the cover of legitimate business operations. April 15, 1999, 6 days after rescue. Federal Detention Facility, Seattle. Victor Kozlov sat across from the federal prosecution team in an orange jumpsuit, his previous confidence replaced by the grim realization that his criminal empire was collapsing. 6 days of interrogation had yielded minimal cooperation, but the evidence seized during the raid was building an overwhelming case against him and his associate. Mr. Kozlov, you're facing multiple life sentences on kidnapping charges alone, Assistant U.S. Attorney Margaret Walsh announced, spreading case files across the table. Add drug trafficking, money laundering, and conspiracy to commit murder, and you're looking at spending the rest of your life in federal prison. Kozlov's attorney, David Chen, had been attempting to negotiate a plea agreement since his client's arrest. My client is prepared to discuss cooperation in exchange for consideration regarding sentencing guidelines and protective custody arrangements. Agent Martinez leaned forward across the interrogation table. What we want is comprehensive, the complete structure of your trafficking network, locations of all facilities, and detailed information about every crime your organization has committed over the past decade. For the first time since his arrest, Kozlov showed signs of wavering. The federal case was overwhelming, with surveillance recordings from Agent Thompson's undercover work, financial evidence tracing drug trafficking operations, and testimony from rescued prisoners who could identify him as their killer. I need guarantees about witness protection, and finally, in heavily accented English. People I would testify against do not leave loose ends. Cooperate. I am dead man. Federal. Walsh consulted with Agent Martinez before responding. We can discuss witness protection, but only after you provide substantial cooperation. Start with Nicole Anderson. Tell us exactly what happened from the night she was taken. Kozlov was quiet for several minutes, calculating his options and the consequent cooperation. When he began speaking, his voice carried the matter-of-fact tone of someone describing business operation rather than kidnapping and torture. Anderson's situation started in September when our surveillance teams reported that college student was conducting regular activities near fish processing facility. She was taking water samples for research project, asking questions about truck movements and late-night operation. Detective Park observed behind one-way glass, taking detailed notes as Kozlov described the systematic surveillance that had preceded his kidnapping. We initially tried indirect pressure, having her followed to make her nervous, arranging for some research locations to become inaccessible, minor intimidation to discourage her environmental project. But Anderson was persistent. When did you decide to take direct action? When she began photographing license plates and documenting delivery schedule. Her research had evolved beyond simple water quality testing to systematic surveillance of our transportation operation. Walsh leaned forward. Walk us through exactly what happened on September 14th. Kozlov consulted with his attorney before continuing. I positioned surveillance team at Red Square Diner to to monitor Anderson's work schedule and identify optimal opportunity for acquisition. Plan was to take her for questioning, determine scope of her knowledge, and decide whether she could be convinced to abandon research. But the kidnapping was premeditated. Of course. We had been watching Anderson 3 weeks, learning her routines and identifying vulnerability. September 14th presented ideal circumstance. Late night, minimal witnesses, controlled environment. Park felt sick as Kozlov described planning that had preceded his abduction. The college student's environmental research had made her a target of people who treated kidnapping teen. Described the actual kidnap. Anderson finished work shift at diner and waited for roommate to pick her up. We approached when she was isolated in parking lot, used sedative injection to incapacitate her, and transported her to mountain facility for interrogation. Agent Martinez interrupted. "You mean torture?" Kozlov's expression remained neutral. "We applied standard interrogation techniques to encourage cooperation and extract information about her research activities, potential compromise of our operation." "What techniques specifically?" Kozlov glanced at his attorney, who nodded reluctantly. "Sleep deprivation through constant lighting and noise interference, irregular feeding schedule, temperature manipulation, isolation, except during questionings, physical coercion, when psychological methods in Park struggled to maintain her composure. Kozlov clinically described 7 months of systematic abuse Nicole had endured. Every detail would be crucial for prosecution, but hearing the matter-of-fact recounting of torture is deeply disturbing. "Did Nicole ever provide the information you were seeking?" "She gave us details about research methodology and confirmed that she had not shared complete findings with professors or environmental organizations, but she refused to identify research location or provide access to water quality data that might compromise our operation." Walsh consulted her note. "What was planned for long-term detention?" "Initial assessment suggested that Anderson could be held for an extended period while we evaluated threat level and determined appropriate resolution. Her knowledge of our transportation schedules made immediate release impossible." "When did you kill her?" Kozlov for a long moment, recognizing his answer would demonstrate calculating nature's criminal enterprise. "Decision was made in March, when federal surveillance activities suggested that her disappearance had attracted more law enforcement attention than anticipated, but the execution was delayed. I wanted to conduct final interrogations to determine whether she had prepared evidence caches or automatic notifications that would trigger she disappeared permanently. Her research background suggested she might have created safeguards." The confession continued for hours, with Kozlov providing details about the trafficking network's broader operation, the systematic abuse of other victims, and the corruption that had enabled the organization to operate with impunity for nearly a decade. "How many people has your organization killed over the past 10 years?" Martinez. Kozlov calculated for several minutes before responding. "Approximately 28 individuals who posed threats to our operation. Law enforcement officers, potential witnesses, business competitors, and individuals who became uncooperative." The scope of violence was staggering, representing a systematic campaign of murder designed to protect a criminal enterprise worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Nicole's survival made her one of the few people who could testify about the organization's method and provide evidence for prosecuting its leadership. As the interrogation concluded for the day, Kozlov had provided enough information to justify federal witness protection in exchange for his testimony against other members of the trafficking network. His cooperation would lead to additional arrests and the closure of facilities throughout the Pacific Northwest. But for Detective Park, the most important revelation was that Nicole's determination to continue her environmental research, even under torture, had nearly cost, while also providing the evidence needed to bring down one of the largest drug trafficking operators in the region. May 20th, 1999, 9 months after Nicole's rescue. DEA Task Force Headquarters, Seattle. The Operations Center had been transformed into a comprehensive intelligence hub with organizational charts covering every wall and evidence files documenting the scope of the criminal network that Kozlov's cooperation had revealed. Agent Martinez stood before the assembled task force, outlining the investigations that would reshape federal understanding of drug trafficking in the Pacific Northwest. "We're looking at a 7-state operation involving drug trafficking, money laundering, political corruption, and systematic murder." Martinez. Kozlov's information has identified 63 facilities, over 300 individuals involved in various capacities, and financial assets worth approximately $600 million. Detective Park studied the organizational chart, the traffic. At the top, a council of 9 individuals who controlled different international drug procurement, domestic distribution, money laundering, political protection, enforcement, shipping logistics, retail operations, financial management, and overall coordination. The network operates like a multinational corporation, Agent Channick, with each council member responsible for specific territories and operational components. They meet quarterly to coordinate activities and resolve conflicts between different elements of the organization. Nicole's environmental research had inadvertently threatened the network's Pacific Northwest operation, which served as a major entry point for heroin and cocaine in traffic Canada and Mexico. The transportation and money laundering facilities in Washington, Oregon, and Northern California processed drugs worth millions of dollars. Nicole uncovered about 15% of their actual operations, reviewing financial records that showed the scope of the money laundering activity. If she'd been allowed to continue her research, she might have exposed distribution networks throughout the western United States. The task force had used Kozlov's information to coordinate with law enforcement agencies in California, Oregon, Idaho, Montana, Alaska, and British Columbia, planning simultaneous operations against facilities throughout the region. The investigation would be the largest coordinated anti-trafficking action in Pacific Northwest. Agent Rodriguez briefed the team on political corruption that had enabled the network to operate with minimal law enforcement interference. We've identified compromised officials, Customs Service, Port Authority, environmental agency, and multiple police departments. Some were paid directly, others were blackmailed or coerced into. The corruption was more extensive than anyone had suspected. A deputy director of the Environmental Protection Agency had provided advance warning about water quality investigation, allowing the network to relocate operation and avoid detection. Several Port Authority officials had falsified shipping manifests and cargo inspections, enabling the trafficking organization to move drugs without official scrutiny. How did they maintain operational security for such a large network? Compartmentalization and systematic elimination of threats. Most participants only knew about their specific roles, and anyone who learned too much about the broader operation was either recruited into leadership or eliminated. Nicole's case had followed this pattern perfect. Her environmental research had made her a threat that required elimination, but her survival had provided federal agents with unprecedented insight into the network's methods and vulnerability. The medical evaluation of rescued prisoners had revealed the systematic abuse used to maintain control over victims, extract information. Psychological torture was combined with physical violence to break down resistance, while threats against family members prevented victims from attempting escape or seeking help. The psychological control methods were as sophisticated as the financial operation, Dr. Sarah Wong reported the task force. Victims were conditioned to believe that cooperation with authorities would result in death, not just for themselves, but for their family. Nicole's psychological resilience during 7 months of captivity had been extraordinary. Despite systematic torture and intimidation, she'd maintained enough mental strength to be considered a continuing threat by her captors, ultimately contributing to her survival when federal agents located the mountain compound. Her descriptions of other prisoners and activities she observed during captivity have helped us identify potential victims and develop leads for additional investigation, Park reported after her latest interview with Nicole. Her memory of events and conversation has been incredibly detailed despite the trauma. The task force preparing for Operation Mountain Thunder, a coordinated strike on trafficking facilities scheduled for June 15th. The operation would involve over 400 federal agents, local police officers, and international law enforcement partners, targeting sites from Vancouver to San Diego simultaneously. We'll have one opportunity to get this right, Martinez warned the assembled agent. If we miss any major components of the network, they'll relocate and rebuild their operations in new territories within months. Agent Thompson, who had maintained elements of his undercover role even after the mountain compound raid, provided final intelligence about the network's leadership. The Council is planning to suspend Pacific Northwest operations temporarily while they assess damage from arrest. They're moving key personnel and financial assets facilities in Mexico and Eastern Europe. The intelligence created urgency for the federal operation. If the trafficking network successfully relocated its leadership and primary assets, it could take years to rebuild the investigation and gather evidence for prosecution. Detective Park had been assigned to coordinate with local law enforcement aides throughout Washington and Oregon, ensuring that state and local resources supported the federal operation without compromising operational security. Her experience with the Nicole Anderson case made her uniquely qualified to understand how organized crime could infiltrate and manipulate conventional law enforcement. "We're going to dismantle the entire network," Park declared during a briefing of Pacific Northwest law enforcement leadership. "But it's going to require every resource we can deploy and perfect coordination between agencies that don't usually work together." As June approached, the investigation that had begun with one missing college student was about to culminate in the largest anti-trafficking operation in Pacific Northwest history. Nicole Anderson's courage in pursuing her environmental research had exposed a criminal enterprise that generated hundreds of millions of dollars through drug trafficking and system. The network had operated for years with impunity, protected by corruption, sophisticated security measures, but Kozlov's cooperation had finally provided law enforcement with the intelligence needed to dismantle the entire organization. June 15, 1999, 4 a.m. Multiple locations, Pacific Northwest. The coordinated assault began with synchronized strikes on 63 locations across 7 states and 2 Canadian provinces, from shipping facilities in Vancouver to distribution centers in Los Angeles. Agent Martinez coordinated the operation at the Federal Command Center in Seattle, watching as real-time reports flowed in from assault teams positioned throughout the region. Alpha sites secured in Vancouver and Seattle, Agent Chen reported through encrypted communication. Multiple arrests, significant drug seizures, no officer casualties. Detective Park led a multi-agency team supporting the raid on the fish processing plant. Cole's environmental research had first exposed the trafficking networks. The facility appeared abandoned from the outside, but internal investigations revealed sophisticated drug processing equipment and storage areas containing millions of dollars worth of heroin and cocaine. Federal agents, everyone on the ground, echoed through the process plant as tactical teams secured each area methodically. The facility's security force caught off guard, with most surrendering immediately when faced with overwhelming law enforcement. Processing equipment seized, approximately 2 tons of heroin and cocaine secured, Park reported commands. Financial records and communications equipment recovered for forensic analysis. The scene was repeated at facilities throughout the region where trafficking operations had been conducted under cover of legitimate businesses. Many locations yielded not only drugs and equipment, but also evidence of the systematic violence used to maintain control over the network's territory and personnel. Agent Rodriguez coordinated the financial component of the operation, executing search warrants at banks, accounting firms, and legitimate businesses that had been used to launder trafficking proceeds. The money trail was complex, involving hundreds of shell companies and offshore accounts, but Kozlov's cooperation had provided detailed roadmaps for following the financial network. "We've seized approximately $150 million in assets so far," Rodriguez reported. Bank records show regular transfers to accounts in Switzerland, the Cayman Islands, and various Eastern European countries. The operation's most significant success occurred at a shipping facility in Tacoma, where trafficking network leaders were conducting an emergency meeting to coordinate their response to law enforcement pressure. Agent Thompson led the assault team that captured 6 councilmen, including the overall coordinator who had managed the network's operations for over 15 years. Council leadership in custody reported. Computers and communications equipment seized with detailed records of financial operations and facility load throughout North America. By afternoon, Operation Mountain Thunder had resulted in 1,247 arrests, the seizure of over 4 tons of drugs, and the recovery of facilities and assets worth hundreds of millions of dollars. The scope of the operation overwhelmed local detention facilities, requiring coordination with federal prisons and immigration processing centers. Detective Park found herself working with victim assistance coordinator, helping to process individuals who had been held in various forms of captivity at a trafficking network. Many were foreign nationals who had been smuggled into the United States and forced to work in drug operations, while others were American citizens who had been kidnapped or coerced into cooperation. Some of these people have been held for years, reported, who had volunteered to help with translation and victim assistance after her experience with the Nicole Anderson, and they've been told their families would be killed, tried to escape contact. The psychological impact on victims severe, systematic abuse having left many unable to trust law enforcement or social service. Specialized counselors and victim advocates work to establish communication with people who had been conditioned to view any contact with authorities potentially fatal. Nicole Anderson observed portions of the operation from the Federal Command Center, where she was working with prosecutors to identify evidence and prepare testimony for the trials that would follow. Her experience as both victim and witness provided unique insight into the network's methods and psychology. Seeing all these operations being shut down makes everything I went through worthwhile, Nicole told Park during a break in the coordination activities. This is exactly what my research was starting to uncover when they took me. The trafficking network had been more extensive than even federal agents had realized. Operations ranged from drug processing facilities to money laundering operations to systematic human trafficking. The scope of criminal activity was staggering, involving careful coordination between legitimate businesses and criminal enterprises. Agent Martinez reviewed preliminary results. The operation continued into the evening. We've effectively dismantled the largest drug trafficking network in Pacific Northwest. But the prosecution phase is going to be incredibly complex. Crimes committed across multiple jurisdictions involving victims from dozens of countries with evidence in multiple languages. The evidence seized during the raids filled multiple warehouses, including financial records, communications equipment, and documentation showing the systematic abuse of hundreds of workers and victims over nearly a decade. Forensic accountants would need months to trace all the financial networks, while victim assistance programs would require years to help rescued individuals rebuild their lives. The prosecution timeline is going to extend for several years, Walsh explained to task. We're dealing with crimes that span international boundaries, involve complex financial networks, and require testimony from victims who speak dozens of different languages. But the most important immediate result was that hundreds of people who had been held in various forms of captivity or forced labor were finally free with access to medical care, legal assistance, and protection from the criminal organization that had exploited. Detective Park reflected on the investigation that had begun with Nicole Anderson's disappearance and evolved into the largest anti-trafficking operation in regional history. One college student's dedication to environmental research had ultimately led to the rescue of hundreds of victims and the dismantling of a criminal enterprise worth hundreds of millions of dollars. As evening fell across the Pacific Northwest, processing centers still working to identify and assist rescued victims, while federal agents continued investigating leads that might reveal additional components of the trafficking network. The operation was a success, but it was also a reminder of the scope of organized crime in North America and the sophisticated methods used by criminal organizations to exploit vulnerable populations while maintaining legitimate business. June 25, 1999, 10 days after Operation Mountain Federal Courthouse, Seattle. The interrogation room was filled with federal prosecutors, FBI agents, and court reporters as Victor Kozlov prepared to provide his had been instrumental. Operation Thunder. Prosecutors needed detailed specific crimes to ensure conviction of the net. Mr. May. Kozlov, let's focus on Nicole Anderson, attorney, arranging case files across the table. Walk us through exactly what happened from the moment she was taken until her rescue. Kozlov glanced at his attorney before beginning, his voice carrying the clinical tone he'd maintained throughout his cooperation with federal authorities. Anderson operation began on September 14, 1998, at approximately midnight at Red Square Diner parking lot. I positioned team of 3 associates to execute acquisition when target was isolated and vulnerable. Detective Park observed from behind one-way glass, taking detailed notes as Kozlov described the kidnapping that had launched 8 months of investigation and ultimately exposed the largest drug trafficking network in Pacific Northwest history. We had been monitoring Anderson's research activities for 4 weeks, ever since our surveillance reported that college student was conducting regular water quality testing near fish processing facility. Her environmental project becoming too detailed and threatening expose our transportation operation. Described the actual kidnapping. Anderson completed work shift at diner and waited for roommate transportation in parking. We approached using standard acquisition protocol, rapid incapacitation, immediate transportation to secure facility, minimal opportunity for resistance or attraction of attention. Agent Martinez leaned forward. You used a sedative injection? Ketamine and midazolam combination, administered via pressure injection system. Subject was unconscious within 30 seconds and remained incapacitated during transportation to mountain facility. Kozlov's matter-of-fact description of drugging and kidnapping Nicole was disturbing, but prosecutors needed his detailed testimony to build comprehensive cases against other network members. What was the purpose of holding her at the mountain compound? Intelligence extraction and threat assessment. We needed to determine scope of her environmental research, identify potential compromise of our operations, and evaluate whether she could be neutralized through cooperation rather than elimination. Describe the interrogation methods you used over 7 months. Kozlov consulted attorney, continuing. Standard psychological pressure techniques combined with physical coercion when necessary. Sleep deprivation through constant lighting and noise interference, irregular feeding schedules, temperature manipulation, isolation, except during questioning sessions. When did you escalate to physical torture? After approximately 6 weeks, when psychological methods had not produced desired cooperation. Anderson demonstrated unusual resistance to standard interrogation technique, maintaining that her research would eventually expose our entire network. Homto Park felt sick listening to the clinical description of Nicole's systematic abuse, but she recognized that this testimony would be crucial for prosecuting the network's leadership and ensuring maximum prison sentences for everyone involved. How long did the physical abuse continue? Intermittently for approximately 4 months. We were attempting to extract complete information about her research methodology while avoiding permanent injury that might complicate eventual disposal. Walsh's voice was ice cold. Disposal? Elimination was always the anticipated outcome once intelligence extraction was complete. Anderson's knowledge of our transportation schedules and facility locations made her too dangerous to release under any circumstances. Why wasn't she killed earlier? Pause, recognizing that his answer would demonstrate the calculating nature of the network's criminal. Anderson convinced us that she had prepared safeguard automated systems that would use research data. He failed to check in environmental organizations that would investigate if her project was abandoned, academic advisors who would become suspicious if she disappeared. Were any of those claims true? We never found evidence of automated system or hidden research, despite extensive searches of her apartment and university facilities. But we could not be certain she was lying, which meant premature elimination could trigger exactly the kind of scientific investigation we were trying to prevent. Agent Chen interrupted. So her survival depended on convincing you she was more dangerous dead than alive? Precisely. Anderson demonstrated remarkable psychological resilience and strategic thinking under extreme duress. Her ability to maintain credible threats while enduring prolonged torture was professionally impressive. The confession continued for hours, with Kozlov providing details of the network's broader operation, the systematic corruption of government officials, and the violence used to maintain control over trafficking territories and personnel. Described the decision-making process for eliminating threats to the organization. Council reviewed security issues monthly and authorized necessary actions based on threat assessment matrices. Factors included level of exposure represented, difficulty of neutralization through nonviolent means, and potential consequences of elimination versus continued survival. How many people were killed to protect the network's operation? Kozlov calculated, tallying numbers that represented systematic murder spanning over a decade. Approximately 67 individuals over past 12 years. Law enforcement officers who approached our operations, environmental researchers investigating contamination, potential witnesses, business competitors, and personnel who became uncooperative or compromised. The scope of violence was staggering, representing a criminal enterprise that had routinely used murder to maintain operational security and territorial control. Nicole's survival made her one of the few people who could provide first-hand testimony about the network's methods and leadership. What was the timeline for Nicole Anderson's execution? Decision was made in March 1999, when federal surveillance activities suggested her disappearance had attracted more law enforcement attention than anticipated. Continued detention was becoming liability rather than intelligence asset. But you delayed the execution. I wanted to conduct final interrogation sessions, extract any remaining information about research safeguards and potential evidence cache. If systems existed that would automatically release environmental data, we needed to identify and neutralize before proceeding with elimination, Walsh consulted. That delay ultimately saved. Federal raid occurred 18 hours before scheduled execution. Anderson's psychological tactics and our operational caution provided just enough time for law enforcement to locate and rescue her. As the interrogation concluded, Kozlov had provided comprehensive testimony about the network's crimes, including detailed descriptions of murder, torture, and systematic drug trafficking operations. His cooperation would enable prosecutors to seek life sentences for the network's leadership while ensuring that victims received justice for years of abuse. For Detective Park, the most important revelation was that Nicole's intelligence and courage had been the keys to her survival. Her ability to maintain credible threats about research safeguards while enduring systematic torture had bought the time necessary for federal agents to infiltrate and dismantle the criminal organization. The confession provided the final pieces needed to prosecute one of the largest criminal enterprises in Pacific Northwest history. March 15, 2000, 18 months after Nicole's rescue, Federal Courthouse, Seattle. The prosecution of the trafficking network's leadership began with extensive media coverage and packed courtroom. As the full scope of the criminal enterprise became public the first time, Nicole Anderson sat in the witness, preparing to testify about her 7 months of captivity and the systematic crimes she'd witnessed during her imprisonment. The People versus Victor Kozlov and Associates represents the largest drug trafficking prosecution in Pacific Northwest history, Judge Patricia Martinez announced. Jury. This case involves allegations of kidnap, torture, murder, and the systematic distribution in communities. Assistant U.S. Attorney Walsh had spent months organizing evidence and witness testimony to present a comprehensive case against 9 defendants, including the trafficking network's council members and key operational leaders. The evidence filled multiple courtrooms, financial records, surveillance recordings, and victim testimony, painting a picture of sophisticated criminal organization. Detective Park testified about the investigation that had begun with Nicole's and evolved into a multi-agency operation spanning nearly 2 years. Her account of the challenges encountered during the local investigation highlighted the network's ability to corrupt law enforcement and interfere with officials. The organization had compromised sources in multiple agencies, explained to them. Information about our investigation was regularly leaked to criminal leadership, allowing them to intimidate witnesses and stay ahead of law enforcement efforts. Agent Martinez provided testimony about the federal investigation and the undercover operation that had ultimately led to Operation Mountain Thunder. Her account of Agent Thompson's infiltration of the network demonstrated the risks federal agents had taken to gather evidence and locate victims. Agent Thompson spent months in deep cover, participating in criminal activities to maintain his credibility while gathering intelligence about the network's operation. His work was instrumental in identifying facility locations and understanding the organization's command's powerful testimony came from trafficking victims who had been rescued during Operation Thunder. Maria Vasquez, who had been held in forced labor for 2 years, described conditions that amounted to modern slavery. They told us our families would be killed if we tried to escape, Vasquez testified through an interpreter. We worked in drug processing facilities with dangerous chemicals, no safety equipment, and constant threats of violence. Many people died from chemical exposure or untreated injury. Nicole's testimony was scheduled for the prosecution's final week, representing the culmination of the case against the network's leadership. Her account would provide the jury with first-hand evidence of the systematic torture and psychological abuse used to control victims and extract information. The defense strategy focused on challenging the credibility of cooperating witnesses and arguing that defendants were minor participants in a larger organization controlled by figures who had not been arrested. Kozlov's test was particularly damaging as his detailed knowledge of the network's operations demonstrated the level of coordination and planning. Mr. Kozlov Were the defendants present during discussions about eliminating threats to the organization? Walsh during directing. Yes. Counsel met monthly to review security issues and authorized necessary action. All defendants participated in decisions of intimidation, kidnapping, and murder of people who threatened our operation. Defense attorneys attempted to portray Kozlov as an unreliable witness seeking reduced sentences through cooperation, but the physical evidence and victim testimony corroborated his accounts of the network's crimes. The evidence demonstrates systematic criminal enterprise spanning multiple years and involving hundreds of participants, Walsh argued during closing statement. These defendants weren't minor players. They were leaders who made decisions that resulted in torture, murder, and the distribution of drugs that devastated communities throughout the Pacific Northwest. Nicole's testimony began on March 20th with careful preparation to help her manage the psychological impact of recounting her ordeal. 12. Sarah Wong had worked months to develop coping testing about traumatic experiences while providing clear and compelling evidence. Ms. Anderson, please tell the jury about your environmental research and what led to your kidnapping. Nicole's voice was steady, described her water quality and the patterns she'd observed that suggested systematic contamination near the fish process. Her account of the investigation demonstrated the thoroughness and scientific rigor that had made her threat to trafficking network. I was documenting chemical contamination patterns that didn't match any legitimate industrial activity. The scope, timing of the contamination suggested illegal operations involving transportation and process materials that weren't being reported to environmental authorities. What happened on the night of September 14, 1998? Nicole described finishing her shift at the Red Square Diner, waiting for her roommate's transportation, and the moment she realized she was being approached by people who intended to harm her. Her account of the kidnapping was detailed and devastating, providing the jury with clear evidence of premeditated abduction. They injected me with something that made me lose consciousness almost immediately. The last thing I remember was trying to call for help and seeing my research notes scattered in the parking lot. What happened during your captivity at the mountain compound? Nicole's testimony about 7 months of imprisonment and torture was difficult for everyone in the courtroom. She described the systematic abuse designed to extract information about her research while breaking down her psychological resistance to cooperation. They used sleep deprivation, starvation, temperature manipulation, and eventually physical violence to try to force me to reveal details about my research methodology and data storage. I convinced them that my death would trigger automatic release of environmental data that would expose their operation. Was that true? No, I hadn't prepared any automated systems or backup data release, but I needed them to believe that killing me would be more dangerous than keeping me alive while they tried to extract information. The cross-examination was challenging, with defense attorneys attempting to suggest that Nicole's memory of events might be unreliable due to trauma and the drugs used during her kidnapping, but her detailed recollections, scientific training, enabled her to provide precise, consistent accounts that undermined attempts to discredit her testimony. Ms. Anderson, isn't it that your captivity has affected your ability to accurately recall specific conversations and events? Defense attorney Robert Chen. My training as a scientist taught me to observe and document details carefully. During 7 months of captivity, I paid very close attention to everything my captor said, did, because I knew that information might be crucial for survival and eventual escape. The trial continued for 8 weeks, with testimony from dozens of witnesses and presentation of thousands of documents demonstrating the scope and sophistication of the trafficking network. By the time closing arguments began, prosecutors had presented overwhelming evidence of systematic criminal enterprise involving kidnapping, torture, murder, and drug trafficking operations worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Wait, May 10th, 2000, 2 years after Nicole's disappearance. Federal Courthouse, Seattle. The jury had deliberated for 5 days before reaching verdicts on the 247 charges against 9 defendants in what had become known as the Pacific Thunder Traffic. Judge Martinez called the court to order as defendant. Attorneys and prosecutors assembled for the reading of verdicts that would determine whether justice had been served for Nicole Anderson and hundreds of trafficking victims. Has the jury reached verdicts on all charges? Judge Martinez asked the jury foreman. We have, Your Honor. Nicole sat in the gallery with Detective Park and Agent Martinez, her hands clasped tightly as she prepared to learn whether her 7 months of captivity and torture would result in convictions of the people responsible for the systematic abuse. On the charge of conspiracy to commit kidnapping against defendant Viktor Kozlov, how do you find? Guilty, Your Honor. Audit. The verdicts continued for over 2 hours, with the jury finding all 9 defendants guilty on multiple charges, including kidnapping, drug trafficking, money laundering, and conspiracy to commit murder. The systematic nature of the convictions reflected the overwhelming evidence prosecutors had presented about the network's operation. Viktor Kozlov was convicted on 31 counts, including charges directly related to Nicole's kidnapping and torture. His cooperation with federal authorities had helped dismantle the trafficking network, but it couldn't erase responsibility for over a decade of systematic violence. Council member Dmitry Volkov received convictions on 27 counts, including conspiracy charges that carried potential life sentence. His role in coordinating the network's enforcement operation had generated millions of dollars through drug traffic while eliminating threats systematic. The verdicts represent justice for hundreds of victims who suffered under this criminal organization, Walsh announced to media gathered outside the courthouse. These convictions send a clear message that drug trafficking and systematic violence will be prosecuted to the fullest extent of federal law. Sentencing was scheduled for July, but the convictions had already achieved the primary goals of the prosecution: dismantling the trafficking network, holding leadership accountable for their crimes, and providing a measure of justice for victims who had suffered years of abuse. Nicole spoke to reporters about the significance of the verdicts for trafficking survivors and the importance of continued vigilance against organized crime. These convictions prove that no criminal organization is too powerful or sophisticated to be brought to justice, Nicole declared. But we must remember that drug trafficking and systematic violence continue throughout our communities, and law enforcement agencies need resources and public support to identify and rescue victims. The impact of the case extended beyond the courtroom conviction. Operation Mountain Thunder had rescued hundreds of trafficking victims, seized over $600 million in criminal assets, and exposed corruption in multiple government agencies. Federal reforms were implemented to improve coordination between environmental and law enforcement. Detective Park had been promoted to lieutenant and assigned to lead a new organized crime unit within the Bellingham. Her experience with the Nicole Anderson case made her uniquely qualified to identify and investigate criminal organizations that used legitimate businesses as cover for traffic. The most important lesson from this case is that individual courage exposes systematic corruption. Park training for law enforcement. Nicole's determination to continue her environmental research, even under torture, ultimately led to the rescue of hundreds of people. Agent Martinez was promoted to Deputy Director of the DEA's Pacific Northwest operation, where she worked to implement national strategy for combating drug trafficking based on Pacific Thunder. Her experience coordinating federal, state, and local resources had demonstrated the importance of interagency cooperation in complex investigation. The trafficking network operated across international boundaries, using sophisticated methods to avoid detection, Martinez explained to congressional investigators studying federal anti-trafficking efforts. Only coordinated operations involving multiple agencies and international partners can effectively combat organizations of this scale and complex. Nicole had returned to university to complete her environmental science degree, though she'd expanded her focus to include the intersection of environmental crime and organized criminal activity. Her experience as a trafficking victim had given her unique insight into how criminal organizations exploit legitimate research and environmental oversight. Environmental research can inadvertently expose criminal activities, Nicole wrote in her senior. Scientists need training to recognize signs of illegal operations and protocols for safely reporting suspicious activities to appropriate law enforcement. The financial impact of the case was enormous: seized assets providing funding for victim assistance programs and law enforcement training initiatives. The trafficking network's estimated $600 million assets were redistributed to support anti-trafficking efforts and provide compensation for victims. Maria Santos, whose cooperation had been crucial to the original investigation, was granted permanent legal status and received federal protection after testifying about the network's operation. Her courage in speaking out, despite threats and intimidation, had helped expose the systematic corruption that enabled organized crime. People need to understand that environmental protection and law enforcement are connected, explained community conference. Criminal organizations exploit our natural resource and threaten the safety of people who try to protect the environment. The psychological impact on everyone involved in the case was profound and lasting. Nicole continued therapy to address trauma from her captivity, while law enforcement officers who had worked the investigation struggled with the emotional weight of what they'd witnessed about systematic violence and corruption. Dr. Sarah Wong established a specialized treatment program for victims of organized crime, recognizing that traditional trauma therapy wasn't sufficient for addressing the complex psychological injury associated with prolonged captivity. Systematic organized crime victims face unique challenges in recovery because their trauma involves betrayal of institutional trust, systematic dehumanization, and often years of psychological conditioning. Dr. Wong explained to medical professionals treating trafficking victims. As the second anniversary of Operation Mountain Thunder, Nicole and Detective organized a memorial service for trafficking victims who hadn't survived captivity. They honored approximately 67 people who had been murdered by the network over 12 years of operation. We remember not only the people who died, but also the communities were damaged by drug trafficking and the environmental destruction caused by illegal operations, said during the memorials. Their suffering was not in vain if we use these experiences to build safer and more just communities. The Pacific Thunder trafficking had become a landmark in federal prosecution of organized crime, demonstrating that sophisticated criminal networks could be dismantled through coordinated law enforcement and the courage of individual victims willing to test experiences. September 14, 2000, 7 years after Nicole's disappearance. Washington State Crime Laboratory, Seattle. Dr. Jennifer Wong stared at the DNA analysis results displayed on her computer screen, hardly believing the breakthrough that had emerged from advanced forensic techniques applied to evidence that had been stored for over 7 years. The new testing methods had revealed genetic material that could finally provide definitive proof of additional crimes committed by the Pacific Thunder trafficking network. "We've got a match," Wong announced to Detective Park, who had requested the reanalysis of evidence collected during Operation Mountain Thunder. DNA from multiple crime scenes matches samples from individuals who were reported missing but never found during the original investigation. Park studied the laboratory report, recognizing names from missing person cases that had never been definitively linked to the trafficking network. How many additional victims are we looking at? At least 12 individuals whose disappearances occurred between 1995 and 1999. The DNA evidence suggests they were all held at the mountain compound before being killed and disposed of at various locations throughout the region. The breakthrough had resulted from advances in DNA extraction and analysis techniques that allowed forensic scientists to identify genetic material from degraded samples that had been previously unusable. Evidence collected during the raids on trafficking facilities had been preserved and periodically re-examined as technology improved. This changes everything about the scope of the case, Park observed, understanding that the new evidence would require reopening investigations that had been closed due to lack of definitive proof. We're looking at additional murder charges that could extend sentences for defendants who are already serving life terms. Agent Martinez, now Regional Director of DEA Operations, joined the briefing to review the implications of the DNA discovery. The new evidence suggested that the trafficking network had been systematically murdering potential threats for years before Nick's kidnapping, establishing a pattern of violence that was even more extensive than previously understood. Victor Kozlov's original confession mentioned 67 murders over 12 years, but these DNA results suggest the actual number might be closer to 90 victims, including people whose disappearances were never connected to organized crime. The advanced forensic analysis had also revealed evidence that would finally provide closure for families who had spent years wondering about the fate of missing relatives. DNA profiles from the mountain compound matched individuals who had disappeared under mysterious circumstances throughout the Pacific Northwest. Nicole Anderson, now Dr. Nicole Anderson, after completing her Ph.D. in environmental criminology, was contacted about the new development. Her survival and testimony had been crucial to the original prosecution, and the additional evidence validated her accounts of violence she'd witnessed in captivity. I remember hearing them discuss previous problems that eliminated, Nicole told Park during a video conference from her office at the University of Washington, where she now taught environmental science and consulted with law enforcement agencies about environmental crime. The DNA evidence confirms that compound was used for systematic murder over many years. The new evidence prompted additional investigations in multiple states, as DNA profiles were compared against missing person database throughout the region. The scope of the trafficking network's violence was becoming clear for the first time, revealing a criminal enterprise that had operated as a systematic killing machine. We're working with law enforcement agencies in Oregon, California, Idaho, and British Columbia to identify additional crime scenes and locate remains, Agent Chen reported during a multi-agency briefing. The DNA evidence is helping us close cases cold for over a decade. The emotional impact on families of newly identified victims was profound. Parents who had spent years hoping their missing children might still be alive finally received definitive answers, though the truth was devastating. At least now we know what happened to Jessica, said Martha Collins, whose daughter had disappeared in 1997 while attending college in Portland. The not knowing was destroying our family. This gives us some peace, even though the truth is horrible. The additional evidence also provided opportunities for enhanced prosecutions of trafficking network members who had received lighter sentences due to insufficient evidence of their involvement in specific murders. DNA analysis could now definitively link defendants to crime scene and victims. We're preparing additional murder charges against 8 defendants who are currently serving time for trafficking and conspiracy, announced Assistant U.S. Attorney Walsh, who had remained involved with the case throughout the appeals process. The DNA evidence provides the definitive proof needed for first-degree murder convictions. Victor Kozlov, serving multiple life sentences in federal prison, was confronted with the new evidence during a prison interview. His reaction provided insights into the systematic nature of the network's violence and the casual way leadership had viewed murder as a business tool. So they found more DNA different when shown the laboratory. What did you think happened to people who threatened our op? We weren't running rehabilitation programs. The new prosecution expected to result in additional life sentence leadership while providing legal closure for dozens of families who had been devastated unexplained disappearances of their relatives. Detective Park, now chief of police in Bellingham, reflected on how the case had shaped her understanding of organized crime and the importance of preserving evidence even when immediate analysis couldn't provide answers. The DNA breakthrough reminds us just expiration date, announcing the new charges. Advanced forensic techniques are giving us the ability to solve cases that seemed just a few years ago. The Pacific Thunder case had evolved from a single missing person investigation into a comprehensive examination of organized crime's impact on communities throughout the Pacific Northwest. Nicole's survival and the subsequent investigation had exposed a criminal network responsible for dozens of murders and the systematic exploitation of vulnerable populations. As the final prosecutions concluded in 2006, the case represented a landmark in both law enforcement methodology and forensic science application. The combination of traditional investigative techniques, undercover operations, and advanced DNA analysis had demonstrated how complex criminal organizations could be defeated through persistent effort and technological innovation. Most important, the DNA breakthrough provided closure for families who had suffered for years without knowing the fate of missing relatives. While the truth was devastating, it also that their loved ones had been victims of systematic criminal violence rather than voluntary appearance. Nicole's ordeal had ultimately led to justice for nearly 90 victims and the complete dismantling of one of the largest criminal organizations in Pacific history. Her courage in surviving 7 months of captivity and testifying about her experiences had made possible the prosecution and conviction of the people responsible for over a decade of systematic violence. The investigation that began with one missing college student had become a comprehensive victory against organized crime, demonstrating that individual determination and advancing forensic science could overcome even the most sophisticated criminal enterprises.